Peace and blessings, everyone. This is your brother Asar Imhotep with the Madhu Andela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. And we are here for another Conversations with Brother Asar. And we are welcoming back our esteemed guest who was with us just a few weeks ago, Dr. Shomarka Keita, and who is a biological anthropologist and a physician with an interest in skeletal biology, the history of ideas about human variation and race, the persistence of racial thinking and colonialism in science, ancient African human biology, early African history, biopiracy, the lack of African researchers in genetics, and the social determinants of health. He received his education at Howard University College of Medicine, Sunning Binghamton, and Oxford University. So we welcome back with us today, Dr. Shomarka Keita. How are you doing today, sir?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
All righty. As always, I like to also acknowledge those who are listening live. And as per the last conversation, we've recently kind of upgraded our account, so we're able to stream on 2 different platforms. So of course we have those of us who are on YouTube, and then those of us who are watching live via Facebook. So on the YouTube live, those who have made themselves known in the chat, I'd like to say hello, peace and blessings, and thank you for viewing to Infinite Solar Mass, Emmanuel Adama, Chavez, Brother Chavez, I am Pablo, Nesubiti Amenhotep, Jeremy Kador, Mr. Trey Day 90, Melanite X, Shesmu Patah Amun, Africa Teacher, and I think I got everyone that has posted on there. And then anyone who is watching live on the Facebook platform. So, and Anointed Sadat Amin Ra and others. So again, thank you all for joining us live, and thank you all, those in the future who will be watching the archive. So, a lot has transpired since we last conversed on this platform. And I know that, with the COVID-19 still causing a lot of trouble for many of us around the United States, more and more discussions and evidence is being brought about in terms of the disproportionate way in which this virus affects those of African descent here in the United States who happen to catch the virus, and it becoming a little bit more deadly, for us versus, in comparison to other ethnic groups here in the United States. So just wanted to get your take on what are the the possible reasons for this type of disparity, and what kinds of things should we be looking at, when analyzing the information that is coming in, concerning this health concern.
Well, thank you for having me again. One word sums up the disparities, or I would say inequities, and it's environment. And environment has many dimensions. We have the socio-political environment, which speaks to the issue of health access, and which is not only an issue for now, but an issue of past generations. That environment also influenced people's ability to get work, and therefore good nutrition, and also stress.
Mhm.
Now, in general, you can think about sort of biological well-being as having several axes. There's the inherited genetic component, the germline DNA, so to speak. That's one thing. And then, of course, there's what I just talked about, the socio-political environment, the context in which that biology works. And then a third axis might be called culture, practices that people may actually have themselves that are not good. For example, the in terms of eating or having to work, or working with certain types of metals. I'm just speaking very broadly. Some of these things may actually have an impact on health. But more specifically, it's been noted that a lot of legacy African Americans work in frontline jobs. A lot of just working class people, period, work in frontline jobs, so they're exposed. So they're exposed more. It's also been stated that people have those with pre-existing conditions, health conditions such as hypertension and diabetes, or being overweight, are more susceptible if infected. Of course, nothing is 100%. However, we need to ask the questions about why is it that there's a greater percentage of people in the legacy Afro-American community with hypertension, diabetes, and perhaps some other problems. And these have to do with, again, a social political system that created stress, broadly defined, such that these disease entities were more likely to be prevalent. And when I say stress or stressors, I mean not only the idea of stress that causes a change in your hormones, that's very real. That can be related to poverty. We can talk about the biology of poverty. I also like to talk about the biology of oppression. And of course, the types of food that people have to eat, the availability, and the availability of having a secure environment, of feeling safe. At a more molecular level, let's say, there are phenomena related to what poverty does to bodies in terms of causing low birth weight, et cetera. And these things that happen to you in the womb also set you up in later life. There's something called the fetal programming hypothesis, which locates the origins of some adult diseases or their appearance in adulthood to things that happen to you while you were in the womb. So if you have a whole population that's under a certain kind of stress related to poverty and poor environment and poor food intake and what have you, it obviously affects pregnant women. That can also affect fetuses. And then this concept of fetal programming KIPS is applicable. And I think this has something to do with it. So I've talked about environment on multiple levels. The obvious, the issue of direct exposure due to the type of work that one has to do. If you don't have work at home, then you're going to be more exposed. I've also talked about environment affecting biology directly and transgenerationally. There's something called epigenetics that also will explain some of this across generations. There's direct toxicity when you talk about environmental racism, in the sense that a woman who is carrying a female fetus has a female fetus already has created her ova, the eggs for the generation to come. So if there's direct cellular toxicity to that woman
Hmm.
through the environment, those in theory could not only affect the development of that fetus, but at a cellular level also affect the quality of those ova in ways that we do not fully understand. These are things that are being discussed at this time. Unfortunately, when it comes to public policy, we don't hear a lot of talk about protecting pregnant women and young children. We don't hear about how do we mitigate the effects of what these social determinants are doing to human biology. Okay, so that's how I would explain that in a in a nutshell. Obviously, you could elaborate on either one of those extensively, and in some cases, aspects of one will be more important than others. What I do want to emphasize, however, is that I have talked about environment, so things that have happened to the biology of people. There's nothing in the DNA, the germline sequence, the DNA sequence, that would make us any more susceptible, or make legacy African Americans any more susceptible to this virus. Nothing that's been identified, nothing that's obvious, nothing about our cytokine reaction, immunological reaction, that's not related to, again, the biology of oppression, the biology of racism in this case, which is a combination of the biology of poverty and the biology of racism, which together I call the biology of oppression.
With this notion of epigenetics and its uh, potential effects on the development of future generations, and certain traits being passed down from generation to generation that have been altered as a result of the stresses of one's environment. Has anyone tried to your knowledge, at least in a professional setting, tried to use that knowledge in terms of so-called intelligence, issues of intelligence being passed on from generation to generation? Like how, like in terms of like, have they tried to racialize it
Well,
in that sense?
no, not as far as I know, and that wouldn't work. Epigenetics is refers to altered gene expression,
Hmm.
and so it's not a reference to DNA sequence. DNA codes for proteins and other structures, and so if you alter the genetic expression, you will alter those proteins and alter the microenvironment. So if we go back to fetal programming, for example, the whole idea behind fetal programming is that women who are under stress, who are pregnant, that their fetuses make adaptations in the womb that allow them to survive, to be born, and that those adaptations, metabolic adaptations, which likely involve epigenetics, are things that later on in life make one more susceptible to becoming uh, uh, hypertensive, overweight, or diabetic, all things being equal in comparison to groups that who didn't, individuals that were not so stressed. So no, we're poverty has been shown. If you look up the science and ecology of early development, there was a program that was run at NIH at one time. It has been shown that poverty, now when I say poverty, I mean deep deprivation. We're not talking about simply the inability to have a fancy car or to not have all the latest toys. We're talking about deep deprivation uh, in reality in terms of nutrition intake, but also a sense of deprivation, a sense of a lack of control. over one's circumstances, not knowing what's going to happen, and really not knowing. The issue of not knowing to the degree that, oh, well, I don't know what's going to happen today. I may have to call my cousin or go to my uncle or go to the neighbor. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about deep deprivation or a sense of it where you don't have anybody, or you don't feel there's anything to turn to. That kind of poverty and deprivation has been shown to actually affect executive function in the brain, especially around issues, certain aspects of literacy and or ability, cognitive issues, although not all of them. I don't have time to talk about all of that now, nor I am an expert on that, but these things can be evaluated, looked up. And I encourage the audience to look these things up, discuss them with their teachers and their professors or people in their community. In fact, the issue about the COVID-19, the bottom line is the point is to survive. So you don't create mythologies that don't allow you to survive. We are under stress, and the legacy African American population does have uh, some issues related to socioeconomics, et cetera. But the point is to survive. So irrespective of those stresses and those strains, we have to strategize. And any group that's in a tough place has to strategize in order to survive. A paper was published recent by Professor McDade at Northwestern, where they actually showed not in any of the African diasporic populations, but in simply poor populations, impoverished populations in the Philippines, where there was clearly evidence of higher methylation, which is connected with the notion of epigenetics, which is the mechanism by which you get altered gene expression, you get methylation of DNA. They clearly showed a deep difference between the upper classes and I believe it was the Philippines, and the poor people, a big difference. So this is not some made up stuff or what have you. Now, given this, our role as people interested in survival, and not simply survival and thriving, is to find ways to mitigate this. And so we have to do our best always. So it means when we can, we eat the right food. It means that we get our children to learn how to eat the right food. I mean, you know the whole problem. We do get the exercise. We do get, you find a way to work these things in. You find a way to avoid stressful situations. And yes, you avoid tobacco, and you avoid other harmful substances. And yes, you protest if in your neighborhood they're doing dumping, practicing racism and environmental racism or classism, and you try to avoid being in certain places around toxic dumps and so forth. And you encourage other people. I would encourage the audience to look at the film Dark Waters, which is about a case that involved a white community where a chemical company, DuPont, was dumping things in the water, and all kinds of cancers and so forth were showing up in the people. The cattle were dying. The teeth of the cattle were turning black. And these were not black people. This is a white community. So these things will affect human beings. And of course, our greatest mission, the greatest thing we've learned as legacy African Americans is to have a big heart. I mean, it is in our culture, in our religion, no matter which particular branch of that religion, but our spirituality writ large, in our literature and in our music, the best of our music, to speak to that survival and to speak to a thriving humankind.
Now, how do we distinguish? Because when we say poverty, it's one of those things that is relative in many respects to the social political makeup of a given territory, as well as the mode of production and things of that nature. So just say, for example, that you have a group of people in a non-capitalist, society, who lives, for example, on the edge of a desert, who doesn't have a rich um, or a diverse, food supply, to determine, what, you know, uh, in terms of balanced nutrients and things of this nature. Like, how would you contextualize, someone who lives just in a non-nutrient rich environment itself without it necessarily being a result of um, poverty and oppression by some dominant group?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. I can't tell you uh, 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 definitively case by case, but I think that in some sense we already know the answer. We know
Mm-hmm.
the answer in the context of malnourishment. We know that there's a better a nutritional profile just for human beings in general. We know that the human population, which emerged in its current form, or the predominant gene pool that we often call modern humans, emerged in Africa, whatever date you want to pick, 150, 200,000 years ago. And that population has subsequently managed to survive, even though there have been some groups that went extinct, some populations. And even now, whole communities get wiped out by earthquakes and what have you. And still the population manages to survive. We also know that there are populations under stress with actual famines, and they still manage to have children and so forth. So when you ask, so the best answer to your question would be is that I cannot tell you uh, uh, other than to say that there are certain things that humans need to eat to thrive, to be at their best. Have these things been determined in terms of the quantity of micronutrients and carbohydrates and protein and fats? I would say there probably are some good data on this, and that yes, there is a notion about what an adequate diet is and what a superb diet is, and so there are people who survive on the edge, as you described, who still manage to reproduce, have children. Now, is that the best society? I mean, would they not be better off? I would say they would be better off if they were better nourished, but survival would be better. There would be less childhood, fewer childhood problems, etc., and population problems. But uh, I think that's the best way to think about that. I don't really have a lot else that I can add to that.
So, in summary, in terms of like with COVID-19 and any other, potential virus that is to come into the future, it really it would really be beneficial for African Americans to, and just African people in general, to think about the overall, their overall economic development because of the future generations and how that affects them in the future generation, but more so in our ability to not only, it's just like, getting insurance for your home or for your car and things of this nature, to help protect you from severe loss. It seems like just having a thriving economy within ourselves would help us to defend ourselves against, to a large extent, diseases, because we would assume that, with better access to uh better foods and safer environments and things, that would help to strengthen our collective immunity, which would help us fight off diseases better in the long run.
Yeah,
What would you say?
yes. In the Whitehall study, which was done in Britain with a huge cohort of people, the bottom line was that that health tracks with wealth. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
wealth tracks with health. I'm sorry, health tracks with wealth. They run in parallel. Now, uh, what I would add to that, though, is that when you're in a situation where uh, the issue is not necessarily to become dominant. The issue is not simply wealth; it's also culture as well.
mm,
So the notion of what a good diet is, you could have all the money in the world and not be eating appropriately. I mean, we know about people that used to do this. I mean, remember there was a time when the wealthy were the ones who, had the rare steaks and all of the beef and this, that, and other, and that's where people wanted to be because that was a sign of wealth. So it's quite possible to be wealthy. Now, in the Whitehall study, it was found that such insults, though, that whether it be tobacco, alcohol, what have you, seem to affect those with more money
mm,
less. And that seems to be related to relative lack of stress. That seems to be, in other words, a sense of being able to control one's environment, one's fate. When one is under chronic stress and the immune system is on fire, all of those chemicals in the immune system of the molecules, the cytokines, etc., in overdrive can cause their own damage. So I'm answering your question this way. Yes, better economics uh, under the assumption that you have a good set of cultural values and that you utilize your wealth in the right way is key. Now, obviously, if you don't have the wealth to begin with, then you can't get the best food and
mm,
so forth. So, or the better food, the better nutrients. Curiously enough, though, I would say that as a strategy for improvement for the lives of poor people, no matter who they are, working people, no matter who they are, and people from any group that may be disenfranchised at any level, that it is possible to get a better diet on one's own, even if one is not wealthy. So I would argue that we can make up for certain things by, you know, growing our own food to a degree. People can have earth boxes. There's something called an earth box, just like people did down south when people grew their own food uh, and uh, and so forth. We can use aspects of the past that we have known uh, uh, in order to do better for ourselves. We do have a cultural problem. I mean, if
mhm,
you're hearing about fast food and great burgers all day long, and you're not hearing about broccoli and kale or
mhm,
corn and greens and so forth, then some of these things may be actually strange to people. I would dare say that there may be in some places there are people who never tasted fresh collard greens without a lot of the way we used to season it with a lot of fat or pork or meat or what have you. There are
mhm,
people who probably don't know what just straight greens taste like steamed. They never had that. But then there's some people that are not eating collard greens at all. So you can rank these things, and so I would leave it to you in your institute and your comrades, your friends, to have further discussions about on the ground, practical, applied ways to improve one's personal health and nutrition. Getting enough sleep. So we have to mitigate. And some people live in some neighborhoods where there's a lot of stress, where they're fearful. Maybe they can't change where they live, but to some degree. But you can do all of the other things that will help mitigate those issues. And we can learn things like, Tai Chi or meditation, things to help calm down the stress levels, as well as eating fresh fruit as opposed to a burger or making deals. I would say that some of the churches and other institutions, even like your own institute that you have, make deals with organic farmers, have churches make deals with organic farmers and other people so that they can get a discount and ship in the
mhm,
food every week to the churches, and then or have the market at the church after the services. We get a deal so it's not so pricey. We know that organic food costs more money. Food that in the deep south, when I was a child, You might see pecans falling on the ground. Which is a source of good fats. You might see apples rotting on the ground, falling off the trees. Apples that have been grown not with fertilizer in the same way. So this is food rotting right in front of your eyes. These are things I saw, not things I read about in a book. So, so we have to be at our best in terms of our own creativity to help create the best quality of life and continue to set examples of excellence in the face of adversity. Kinds of excellence that we saw when Dr. King is at his best, when Alhaji Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, is at his best, when our artists and writers are at their most creative, pushing the boundary venue they have, when you have someone like a Du Bois thinking about the best, but also writing sometimes fictional stories about the possibilities of the future.
Afrofuturism in
Well,
many respects.
no, well, that futurism is, but the future is right now. You and I are it right here. Even though I'm a lot older than you, but we're right here. It's right now.
All right, we have this one question from the chat, and I wanted to get to it before it disappeared. But Richard White asks, is there a tipping point in the environment that changes the gene frequency in population?
Okay. Now this is a very interesting question. And when you talk about evolutionary changes, to talk about changes in gene frequency, you can talk about processes. Some of these relate to selection, and therefore what we call adaptation. Some of them relate to something called which is a random change in frequency, transgenerational change in frequency. Okay, so when you say a tipping point in the environment, that's a very abstract notion, but let's talk about it in the way you talk about it. You could have a severe environment which causes the death of young children. So you have to die. Evolution works by working on people who don't reach the age of reproduction. See, it has to work on you before you reproduce. So if you have fetal loss or childhood loss related to some severe change in the environment, such that you have a non-representative sample of the children who die, that can alter the gene frequency in the next generation. This is a change over time proposition. However, you can also have what's called genetic drift that's related to simply a situation. It's not adaptive. It has to do with random changes in gene frequency. And these can be related to, well, one major mechanism would be, for example, that just that some people in a given population don't reproduce. And for whatever reason that might be, the next generation would not be reflective of that gene pool. Also, in theory, if you had a population spread over a mountain range and a part of the mountain collapsed, killing half the village, then whatever's left may not be a representative sample of the population, and so you would have that would be a different gene frequency there. So death of children, in some particular manner could lead to a change in the gene frequency of the next generation, because those people and whatever their genetic variation wouldn't be passed on. But also you could have disasters happen at another level. And like I said, there's this thing that can just happen called genetic drift that tends to happen in small populations where you don't have the smaller population doesn't represent the larger population from which it came. Even if it's not so much that the population moved away, it's just that other people didn't have children, or let's say they did get killed.
Mm,
There's also a special case of genetic drift called founder effect, where you have a group of people move away and their gene pool is not representative of the population from which it came. So they migrate away. An example of this is actually to be found in South Africa, where the Dutch white South Africans, called the Afrikaners, when they left Holland, they had a higher frequency within the Dutch Reformed Church, those who practice that religion, of a certain kind of deafness. So you have a higher frequency of that in South Africa than you do in Holland. And okay, all right.
mm. I think we kind of answered this, but I'm gonna put this question up. So, Phi Lighten Tist, I don't know how you pronounce that name, but this, I don't know if it's a he or she, but I like how he said evolution works on you before you reproduce. Please, Brother Sar, ask him if traumatic experiences being imprinted on children down the genetic line exist. Does that mean that, in essence?
No, no, I was referring to something different. Simply
Okay.
that natural selection works on by eliminating members of the population before they reproduce.
Mm,
Having said that, we talked about epigenetics and we talked about traumatic experiences. So, yeah, it's quite possible that trauma can change, traumatic experiences can change developmental pathways. We know, for example, that children who have been subject to warfare or in the middle of war, that their cerebral volume will actually decrease until they get out of those circumstances. So you can make the argument that children who are chronically traumatized or abused in whatever way you want to think about that, severely. Now, this is where we get into how much abuse and how much this and I can't answer that, but we do know we have hard data,
mm,
factual data that show that you actually get a reduction in cerebral volume. The cerebrum is, the main brain piece, and that but it will recover. It will recover. So, your traumatic experiences on children, it could affect them in different ways, developmentally, and also physically. A traumatic experience of poor nutrition is one type of genetic experience. An emotional traumatic experience is another kind of traumatic experience. So the bottom line is, yes, trauma can affect the development of children, and to the degree that they may affect uh, what we talked about in terms of epigenetics, altered gene expression, this might also be something that would pass down. It is not a change in the DNA sequence. It is a change in the gene expression. Please look up the Nova DVD. You can find it on YouTube, but different people have altered it. But look for the original PBS Nova, called The Ghost in Our Genes, or The Ghost in Your Genes. The
mm.
Ghost in Your Genes. And when you see that, you'll get a much better understanding of what we can go through here.
I want to kind of switch gears now. I know we were to talk about the um, bioenvironment in relationship to the Badarians and this, and why the study of this group of people is important to the larger discourse on the quote unquote origins of the ancient Egyptians. And so I wanted to, ask you just a little bit to speak about, who were the Badarians, and why is the study of them important in terms of answering, for example, if the ancient Egyptians were a people who came from Asia versus what you call super-Saharan Africa, or were these people just indigenous people who always just been in that locale? How would we determine these things, and why are the Badarians important for this particular conversation?
Well, historically speaking, the Badarian culture, uh, which is named after a modern village in Egypt. There was nobody in ancient Egypt called Badarian or Badarian, but the culture that was founded El Badari, quite old, uh, is looked upon as being in the sequence, at least traditionally, of the pre-dynastic cultures that lead to dynastic Egypt. So as the late Michael Hoffman said, uh, ultimately, everything traces back or things trace back to the Badarian. So Badarian pottery has been said to be some of the finest pottery ever made in Egypt. And this pottery was made between 4400 and 4000 BCE. And so some of the people who have said this have talked about when they say ever made in Egypt, they mean throughout the dynastic period as well. So over the course of greater than 4,000 years. There's another way that some people have begun to think about the Badarian, and they see the Badarian as a part of something called the primary pastoral community. So I would again ask the viewers to look up the article in the journal Antiquity. You can find it and print it offline by Wengrow, Wengrow, David Wengrow, and his team or his collaborators in the journal Antiquity. And it speaks to the cultural convergence of the Neolithic in the Nile-Valley, Africa's place in Africa. I mean, Egypt's place in Africa. So you could view the Badarian as being a part of this primary pastoral community. The Badarians were semi-sedentary. They did some farming, but they were also apparently agro-pastoralists too. They did some herding. And their ceramics, their pottery tradition seems to have been a blend of both Saharan and Nilotic traditions. The black-topped ware, which is also rippled, has these two different traits seem to have originated or been first. Let's just say they were first in two different places. You find the blacktop pottery in the western desert of Egypt, the western desert, which is most certainly not in the Near East. And you find the rippling first in the Khartoum tradition of pottery. And in the Badarian, you see both of them. You have rippled blacktop ware. It's actually quite beautiful and interesting when you can look at it up close. This pottery tradition, the blacktop tradition within the Nile Valley, because El Badari is within the Nile Valley, along with aspects of their lithics and other things about their culture, seem to be directly, not only temporally antecedent to the next phase of pre-dynastic Egyptian culture, but its actual ancestors. Something, just because something comes ahead of something in time doesn't mean that it's actually culturally connected. And you can't always prove things in particular ways in any case. When it comes to the people, when you do look at the various studies that have been done on Badarian crania, published by different people through the years, including studies, legitimate studies going back to the 1950s, you see that the Badarians will group with Nubian populations, that they'll show great affinity with them, and sometimes other populations even more southernly, even more so than with dynastic Egyptians. However, northern dynastic Egyptians, we don't want to get too carried away with that observation, simply because if we understand that populations exist along a continuum in most parts of the world, then yes, the Badarians are part of the Nilotic world, which is part of the African world, or the Saharo-Nilotic world. David Wengrow uses the terminology primary pastoral community. I would prefer a phrase like Saharo-Nilotic tradition or Saharo-Nilotic complex, and other people have used similar terminology to that. And the reason I emphasize this is because I want to comment on the fact that both the Sahara and the Nile Valley have a role in this. The earliest agriculture, in terms of seed and barley agriculture, occur in northern Egypt. And those crops, the wheat and the barley, clearly came from the Near East, although there may have been some wild barley in the Delta that is covered over by water now, early sites that we can't find. But the fact is that these crops uh, emerge in northern Egypt uh, some 2,000 years after they were in the Near East. Some people have taken this to mean that farmers migrated from the Near East. However, that's not true. When you look at the archaeology of the presence of these grains, what you see is that they were integrated into an indigenous foraging strategy. Whereas if farmers had simply come, they would have brought their whole repertoire with them if there had been a so-called Neolithic revolution. This did not happen. You had African cattle, which were domesticated. I believe that this is still correct, irrespective of whether the dates, the early dates that Fred Windorf claimed for them are true. But I believe that the cattle are African cattle that were domesticated first, but they may have gotten some Near Eastern cattle as well. And the grain crops that we know about, uh, the wheat and the barley that later on become Egyptian staples. Initially, they were just part of a seasonal strategy. So there was no mass migration of people from elsewhere. And of course, as you know, irrespective of which type of classification for languages we want to adhere to, the words for wheat and barley and even the sheep and the goat, and that's the other thing, the sheep and the goat that are used in Egypt and Africa in general clearly came from the Near East, but they were also adopted into African strategies of existence by African people. But curiously enough, the sheep and the goat do not have names from the Near East. They're not the loan word. So we have rock paintings. Again, here's the Saharan role where we see Egyptians or proto-Egyptians or Saharan people experimenting with pinning Barbary sheep. So they had a name for these sheep. So I suspect that when they get these other sheep come in, that they simply transfer the names. And they may have been experimenting with plants as well. There's some evidence with this, such that they had names. So then when they start using wheat and barley in a particular way, they have names for these things also. Again, this argues against some sort of migration of the Neolithic, what some people would call a particular type of diffusion, demic diffusion, change of culture by mass migration. This is not what happened. And none of the evidence will support that, as you and I have talked about in the past. So the Badarians can be seen as antecedent to the phases of culture that, if you think about it culturally speaking, and as a population, they belong right where they are. So there's Badarian culture, there's Badarian people, antecedent in the pre-dynastic chain, or if you want to see the Badarians as a part of this primary pastoral community, which extends down into Sudan. And now there's interesting information about this as well, that has all kinds of ramifications. It may be that this primary pastoral community had its origins further south or in the desert, and is older there. On this are not firm, and that's not really, it's not really important. This is all a part of Saharo-Nilotic Africa, and this is the important thing to remember. And so what we want to do is encourage young people to get interested in archaeology, Egyptology, early African studies. Everybody isn't going to be an engineer or Wall Street person. We need Wall Street people too to help fund these kinds of enterprises. We need people at historically Black colleges to make places, create departments, or be innovative and interdisciplinary in the sense departments with other topics. Interestingly enough, this kind of thing was talked about even by Du Bois, as I recall. So these are not new ideas. The issue is what we want to do is create a thriving human community, and we want uh, all people, but that also includes African Americans. And I say legacy African Americans. When I use the word legacy, I'm referring to people who are Middle Passage descendants. There's a distinction to be made if you want to even talk about the biology piece between, say, someone like Barack Obama, whose father was from Kenya, and someone who is a descendant of Carolina, in terms of epigenetic marks, developmental pathways, and all of that stuff. Not simply because his mother was white, but also because his father was from Kenya. So, so we need to enlarge the way we think about things, and we need to understand that when it comes to a thriving community, that we all have a role, no matter your level of education, no matter your so-called station in life. We are all part of the struggle. I will say, however, also that at least for legacy African Americans, this does not mean that we accept racism. This does not mean that we do not struggle. This does not mean that we do not claim our place. As James Baldwin said, we are the people who help build the country. Even our current president said to a group of African Americans, "Oh, you built the country." Well, okay. Given that that's the case, we what is deserved is deserved, and this must be always talked about and fought for. And wherever we see racism, whether it's in scholarship or the legacy of certain kinds of thinking, we don't accept it. We don't accept it. We forge ahead, and we don't need to forge ahead with mythology. We forge ahead with the best data, and we simply don't accept racism and Eurocentrism or any other centrism that is not good for the well-being of people.
All right. Just wanted to acknowledge on the Facebook chat Professor Manu M. Pim, who sends his greetings to you, Dr. Keita, and myself. He says he's on the move, but he just wanted to stop in for a brief moment. So thank you for catching us live, Professor Manu M. Pim. Many may know him for his research in Nubia and dealing with Nubian scholarship. And I'm going to take this question here. So Mr. Trey Day 90 says, given the findings of the M2 lineage in dynastic Egyptian remains, for example, Ramses III, and the absence of M2 in the recent study on the 8,000-year-old West African findings, along with various oral traditions, I assume this is supposed to be a two-part, because I think it's a limited, like how much you can text in. So I don't know if that was a full.
I'm not sure about the 8,002-year-old, but he's referring to Ramses III when the Wit-Athy algorithm was used on the rest of his and other aspects of his genome. It was decided or determined that he was likely E1B1A using an older terminology. And that turns out to be the same as something that we call V38. And people who have M2 have V38. At one time, you wouldn't have seen the V38 because as science has, as they've sequenced more things, more has been put into marking these lineages. But I'm not sure what he's saying. I'm not sure the absence of the M2 and the 8th. I'm not familiar.
I know the study, and I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there was a recent study
Mm-hmm.
that was done in a locale in Cameroon,
Mm-hmm.
which essentially said that the current population in that area is 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 not the original population in terms of the numbers, but uh the the original people there were like the Batwa and Booty type, quote unquote pygmy type people. So they did a sample. They did two different um, ages of samples. So one was 8,000 years ago, and actually it was four samples that was taken. So
Mm-hmm.
two of them were 8,000 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
two of them were 6,000 years ago. So
Mm-hmm.
based on those four samples in this area in Cameroon, they suggest that the Batwa pygmy type people were the indigenous because both were in alignment with that, but there was no evidence that the quote unquote like Bantu type speakers were in the areas originally at this time.
Okay. Yeah,
Which
let me just say something. There are a lot of different Y chromosome lineages. The key Y chromosome lineages in Africa are associated with the following named haplotypes: A, B, and E. Those are the predominant ones. You also have some others that are thought to be the results of back migration into Africa. In parts of Africa, you have a high precedence of the A lineages, and you have amongst some of the people that you've mentioned, you have B lineages in the Sudan and some with a small percentage in Egypt, but scattered around the entire continent. The E haplogroup is the predominant one, and uh, so it should not be surprising. All of these lineages emerged in Africa, and indeed the key lineage, the M168, that's ancestral to most modern humans, which is downstream the markers that define the A and the B, is the atom, so to speak, the marker that defines the atom. It's the BT haplogroup defines most living humans in Africa and outside of Africa. So that's the best way to answer that. But that's not a surprise. But also, let's not get too excited, except when we're dealing with a known individual about 4 or 5 samples of this, that, or the other.
yeah,
You can't make population statements on that. That's not the way you think about populations. Now, maybe if you've got a specimen that's 100,000 years old, it's a little bit different. The older it is, then the more valuable a DNA sequence is. But I would say that at the population level, you have to always think about things with some care and with some restraint. But that's not particularly surprising. Let me answer it that way. Uh, the P2 transition is ancestral to the M2 and to the M35. These are the major clades in Africa that form the E haplogroup of the E haplogroup. Uh, there are other pieces of the E haplogroup too that are not as common. The E haplogroup is defined itself by M96. And I like to use the mutation names. There are other mutations that have now been associated, some slightly before, some slightly after. But what I'm saying still is foundationally or fundamentally true.
given the issue of sample size, and just like with the Abusir study, those four samples originated from one particular spot. To what extent? And I know you shared a paper with me concerning the the issue of multidisciplinariness and the relationship or lack thereof with genetics and history in terms of how valuable to a historian is genetics at this point, at this stage of the game, as it regards trying to answer issues of history, given that the criterion for, what constitutes excellence in those two different fields in terms of history and in terms of genetics are so drastically different?
Okay. Now, you've actually asked a very big question,
Okay.
a very, very big question, because it depends on what one means by history.
Hmm.
And Africanists like Chris Ehret, African scholars have a different view of history and when they want to speak about history than traditional Western scholarship does. So, like one of your own teachers, Karen Kleiman, who wrote a book on the history in Central Africa using archaeological and linguistic sources. Some people would say, oh, no, this is more about prehistory. Well, this whole divide between when you talk about history, prehistory, this is a philosophical issue. It's all history, as someone wrote some time ago, and it's yeah, part of the answer to your question has to do with that.
Hmm.
Now, more specifically, though, in the paper that you were referring to, the paper by Igorova, it's been pointed out in the 2010 issue of a journal called Biosocieties,
Hmm.
how oftentimes geneticists arrogate to themselves a notion of truth that is nothing that is above what historians or archaeologists do. They believe that what they do is a heavier or more important discipline.
Hmm.
Geneticists see themselves as being a service discipline to history, question methods, context of the geneticists, and sometimes the minds don't meet. The geneticists helping to solve historical problem, but oftentimes do not publish in historical journals, are not interested in historical or archaeological, and this is probably vice versa. So you don't get a good meet between the two all the time. Although increasingly, though, you do see some working together. You do see where, but still they tend to be published in biomedical or quote unquote science journals as and so this would have to be remedied. Uh, Genes don't tell you a given moment in time. So if you find some genes in I mean, some ancient DNA from 8,000 years ago in a place where there are some people there today, and so, or you find the same genetic markers or what have you, it doesn't mean that the people at that time, if you could go back in a time machine and talk to them, that they would tell you that they're the same people that you have today. I mean, you have to be extremely careful about that sort of thing. And this is also true with ancestry testing. Africans of all stripes oftentimes may have different ethnic identities, and ethnic identities have changed over time. So what somebody may be calling themselves right now is not necessarily what they call themselves in other contexts, or depending on who's asking the question. I can tell you a very brief story about that. One time during Ramadan some years ago, I met someone from Senegal, and and we were talking, and it turns out that he come from a religious family, religious scholars, at least locally speaking in Senegal. And I said, "Oh, what ethnic group are you asking me?" And he told me he was Wolof.
Hmm.
I said, "Oh, okay. We know Sheikh Anta Diop was Wolof. Okay, so Wolof." But then he kept talking, and the more he talked, turns out that his mother was from the Lake Chad region, and his father had met her because he'd been a part as pastoralist. They were actually Fulbe, Fulani, or Tukulor. I said, well, wait a minute. I mean, I talked to him. I said, but you just told me that you were Wolof. So imagine the scientist who goes to a village someplace and they talk to people and people identifying with the language they currently speak. Oh, we're Wolof.
Yeah.
And they're not telling you, they're not giving you a lineage, but they put that in the database as Wolof. Then you get your ancestry tested and
Hmm.
it matches with that person. So you call yourself Wolof, but in actual fact, that person wasn't Wolof.
Yeah.
Okay. But I don't have at this moment. We will have to not talk about that.
Mhm.
But yes, there is a conflict, and the Abusir paper has various problems. The title. There's a body of literature now about spin in biomedical research. The title is misleading. It would imply to you that they had a baseline going back to the Badarian or before in the Nile Valley, and that only after a certain moment in time did so-called sub-Saharan genes come into the population. They do admit in parts of the paper that they have one sample from one place. And they also say, well, if they'd sample from southern Egypt, they might, get different results. However, the media picked up on the headline and picked up on the discussion, which does not integrate the caveats, does not integrate the problems fully into the discussion. The data that they got are real, but the title is interesting of the paper when they say that the ancient genomes suggest. This is not the way we usually use English. The genomes don't suggest anything. It's our interpretation of the genomes. The genomes can't talk. Okay, the data do not, as Milford Wolpoff once famously said, the data do not speak for themselves. He said he's been in a room with lots of data, and he has not heard any of the data talking to him. So no, data get interpreted via paradigms and what one knows. And the same is true actually in the context of medicine. What does abdominal pain mean? Well, it depends on some other historical person's medical history and what have you. Well, what does the loss of eyesight mean? Well, it depends on some other things. In and of itself, it means nothing until you put it in context, and you most certainly can't. You have to. It gets interpreted. But the DNA samples that they got, you should think about the results that they got. Think about various things: forced settlement of northeast, of Near Easterners in Egypt, migration to that part of Egypt all along from the Near East, settlement of women weavers in the area, slave women from the Near East being brought into service, but to have children for families that had no children. I've spoken with some very prominent Egyptologists about that issue. In other words, you can tell a local history of Abu Sir from the point on. You can say, well, these genomes indicate contact with the Near East. You can't assume that they mean that it's been that way for all time and all places for all of Egypt. You can talk about one place. So they overgeneralize. And also the sample that they use to represent so-called sub-Saharan Africa isn't the one that would have been appropriate in the Egyptian context. You should have gone right up the Nile if you wanted to do that. But also that whole project, what is it about looking for the sub-Saharan? It reminds me of somebody like Morton in the 19th century, who very specifically was on this issue about the issue of a black presence in Egypt. Other European scholars had thought for a long time, Volney and others, that the early Egyptians had been quote unquote black, and to whatever degree and whatever way you want to use that word. And even Morton, in the end, who initially said no, they were Asiatic, they were this and that. In the end, believe it or not, Morton himself says they were African, but they were Caucasian. They had emanated from, the Caucasian race. They were polygenesis, so different races had different cradles. So these were African Caucasians, is what Morton was basically saying.
The dark ones.
Yeah. Well, no, he didn't even say that. But there's an article by Bernasconi called uh, on this issue. Robert Bernasconi, I believe it's entitled "Black Skins, White Skulls" or something like that, and where he goes through this history and he demonstrates that the uh, what the real purpose was. Curiously enough, not in Glidden, who wrote that giant book, Types of Mankind, even they wound up disagreeing with Morton at one point before Morton changed his mind, saying that no, these people are African. They came from Africa. When you look at them, what is Asiatic about them? They had come into some new woodcuts from Lepsius and so forth. But of course, they were still saying, well, they're Africans, but they're not quote unquote Negroes. And so the whole point of all of that is to try to disconnect the Nile Valley from Africa. And of course, we now know, at least based on Y chromosomes and good DNA work, and whether it's STRs, Y chromosome work, and other things. And now, with good Egyptologists from Europe who have talked about ongoing interactions with Nubia, we know that this population is very much interconnected, even although it may have gained connections with the Near East at whatever different moments in time. This is still happening on African soil. It's part of African history in an African environment, uh, with the cooperation or agreement and integration agency, I want to say, of an African population in the Nile Valley. Okay.
I want to ask, like, why is it even important to talk about the origins of the ancient Egyptians? Like, what is the motivation for that question? Why isn't it just automatically assumed that they originated there and was part of the in autochthonous, people who have been there, for hundreds of thousands of years?
Well, no, I think that if you read very carefully, and I'm probably going to have to end on this, if you read very carefully, a lot of the literature, even from people like Adolf Ehrman, going back 100 years, and so forth, you will find a variation in opinion even amongst European scholars, white scholars. You'll find a variation in opinion. At what point there was some consensus that the Egyptians had to be white? When this emerged, I don't know. In fact, if you talk to well-known Egyptologists, including people that I studied with at one point, they will tell you they can't identify a conference where it was decided, that oh, so and so is the case, and then, if you read very carefully, varying scholars and so forth, you will find some who do say, including Egyptologists, mainstream people like Adolf Ehrman, who say, oh, well, there's been a debate about the Egyptians. The ethnologists say that, they have an African origin, but the philologists say they have a Semitic origin, and, you see this debate. And then he goes on to describe why the ethnologists, by which he means natural historians in this case, show that, oh, there's a variation up and down, a gradual variation where there's no break in the population. So he's really saying that you can't divide up this climb, this variation, that these people are interconnected in the Sahara-Nilotic region. So that idea, he expresses it quaintly, but it's very clear that there are whole groups of scholars in some places. So this is why I say, young scholars can excavate this. They can do an archaeology of knowledge and excavate these things. I've done some of this. This is why I'm interested in the history of ideas, and I can show it. And I will debate anyone, anywhere on this issue to discuss it. Modern studies, or whether it be on the Badarians, Nakata, what have you, you can show that they are from right where they are. And all human populations are related to each other, just to varying degrees. And individuals may have all sorts of things in their own personal family tree, and so it's complex. But the Nile Valley civilization emerged from a Saharo-Nilotic base, and its culture, its language
Mm-hmm.
are all clearly embedded there. and its acceptance of other people, Near Easterners and others, even today. Migrants from Greece. I mean, 100 years ago, there's Greek communities in Egypt. 100 years ago, there were some 2,000 years ago. You have to accept the notion of a complex society. Same is true in West Africa. During medieval, the times of Mali, you had different communities there that paid homage to a Malian king, Malian lineage. So this is accepting and using the fact of African diversity. You deploy it as a primary concept, fundamental concept, and don't get trapped into Eurocentric notions of homogeneity and uniformity of groups as a fundamental starting point of human beings. When in fact, even in Europe, the modern humans who came from Africa, who went there, who still had their tropical bodies, interbred with another group of either a different species, depending on what you think, or another subspecies, another race of humans called Neanderthals. And again, there was interbreeding. It's very interesting how people get caught up in these things. But it's worth discussing because one discussion doesn't solve a problem. One ongoing information, and fighting racism and fighting bias and misrepresentation of data in science, spinning data, not giving alternative stories, alternative versions of what may have happened, or why a particular state may be the case. This is a kind of, I don't know if you want to, but this kind of thing is to be criticized. And the point is to try to do a better job. We all make mistakes. But we want to do a better job. Okay.
And I know that we have you for a short time today, and so I'm hoping I can get this one question in, and this will be the last one before we depart. And I know many people have questions, and some people have asked some questions on other forums. So I'm gonna just ask this one from the Egypt Search Forum. So Beyeku asked, and it's kind of lengthy, so I'm not going to read all of it, but it's in the context of European samples. He asked, while ancient DNA in Africa exists and more is forthcoming, there is still a lot to be desired. Some of the main avenues for migration, such as the Nile-Valley and the Sahara and Sahel belt, are lacking in samples. Using Eurasia as a model and drawing from your experience as far as the study of African physical remains, language, pottery styles, stone bone tool usage, fossils, etc., what type of genetic substructure and turnover would you expect to see as the ancient samples come in? What population centers would be best sampled in trying to reveal some of this ancient diversity and how it relates to population movements of the past and contemporary Africans?
That's one of those kinds of questions that really can't be answered. When you ask what would be expected, I would have to really sit down and think to generate a predictive model. Certain core outlines seem to be well defined in terms of the structure of our modern human beings. Certain things would not surprise me. It would not surprise me, for example, if the M and N haplogroups, which we normally think of as having arisen in the Near East, or what some people call Eurasia, or in the Near East. It wouldn't surprise me if they were also found in Northeast Africa. At the age of these things, you're in the Paleolithic period, and people are migrating back and forth. At what time and on what day a particular mutation occurred, if somebody was going back and forth, no one can really say. We assume certain things based on models about the greatest diversity, and those are generally true. There are some exceptions, but those are generally true. It's very interesting about this concept of Eurasia, because I believe that we could just as easily develop a construct called Africasia, Africasia, and that would have just as much explanatory power or another way of grouping data and information as talking about Eurasia. Remember, Europe is not homogeneous linguistically. For example, the way people think it is, using even standard linguistic criteria as opposed to maybe more creative or more innovative criteria. For example, Basque is not an Indo-European language. It may be left over from the late Paleolithic period in Europe. But Basque is not Indo-European. But are the Basque Europeans? Yes. Hungarian is not Indo-European. But who is going to remove the Hungarian people from Europe? Finland, the Finnish people speak Finno-Ugric language. Again, it's not Indo-European, but it's not in the same family as French or Spanish or Greek even. But that doesn't lessen their Europeanness, right? And finally, Indo-European itself is said by those who believe in, who accept that construct, to have come from the central steppes of Asia, right? And basically overrun perhaps other languages, overtaken other languages more related to Basque or language isolates in Europe. No Indo-Europeanist, no European scholar loses sleep over the fact that Indo-European came from Asia. Or no one uses Basque or the Basque people as the defining Europeans, such that everybody else is admixed with some foreigner. They don't approach them, but yet Africa was approached with that kind of thinking, that kind of model. So I leave you with that as food for thought. Let us leave to Africa what belongs to Africa, whether it's a blue-eyed Amazic or blue-eyed Berber who's got a Y81, M81 lineage that's an E haplogroup, but perhaps have some other lineages and other DNA from other places. That ethnic group, that group was crafted in Africa, emerged in Africa. Let's think in terms of emergence theory. This is how we have to approach things when we talk about this. And these are facts on the ground. These are facts on the ground. This is not hypothetical. These are facts that can be derived from reasonable, from good evidence and reasonable interpretations, as opposed to unreasonable ones or ones that make assumptions that come from a zeitgeist, a Eurocentric zeitgeist, an assumption about what was, and that crops up in pieces like the mummy genomes piece, and they don't necessarily realize it. And a lot of us have inherited some ways of thinking, and we don't even realize where the prejudice comes from, and that crosses all domains. That crosses all domains, whether it's people talking about hair, or people talking about certain types of music, or people talking about certain types of art, or people talking about certain types of who deserves what, and what does it take to get equity. We don't want equality, we want equity. We want equity, and there's a difference. And I think everyone knows the difference. And so I'll finish with you there, and thank you.
Well, I appreciate you greatly for coming back on the show. And, maybe one day we can set up kind of a master class, for you on a particular topic, and get everyone in on that, on something more specific in that domain. But I just want to say as well I didn't get a chance to say it live, but to thank all of the people who have donated to the channel. The latest being Brother Ivan. And actually, Brother Ivan, I think your book comes in today. And so I think I got a notice for your book. And so the book I'm talking about is this text here, Towards a Comparative Dictionary of Chicam in Modern African Languages. Was released this month. And, it's the latest text from me. So for those who are interested in this, you can go to the website and check that out. I appreciate everyone who is in the chat on YouTube, as well as everyone on Facebook.
Mr. Imhotep, let me just say one other thing. Is that okay?
No problem.
Last thing, yes. The African diasporic world is wide and large. It not only includes North America, in the sense of the U.S. and some Afro-Canadians. It also includes Latin America. Now, not everyone in Latin America with some African ancestry calls themselves an Afro-descendant, even if they don't deny the African ancestry. But and some people do deny it. Some people obviously have a greater degree of that African ancestry. So we should be interested in the Latin American world and in many different ways. There is no Latin America without Africa. There is no Latin America without Africa, period. But it's an excellent place to understand this concept of people having varying degrees of ancestry, but where ancestry per se doesn't dictate social identity. We also know of other places, other countries at other times where there have been people of African descent who were proud of it, but that wasn't their primary identity. Did not Alexander Pushkin, the father of modern Russian literature, say when some of his opponents were making fun of him, they say, oh, they can only be talking about me because I am the only Russian man of letters with a black ancestor. I'm the only Russian man of letters. He does not say I'm the only black, he says I'm the only Russian, and he was a great Russian man of letters with a tropical African ancestor. And I am sure that if we looked and dug into many, many stories in the circum-Mediterranean area, both ancient and more recently, we would find all kinds of stories of families that are interconnected. See, this is the great lie about racial thinking, the racial schema, and the box that some people have put people in and put academics in and other things in. No, far more connections than disconnections. And so let's keep that in mind. And so perhaps you will interview some Latinos, some who call themselves Afro-Latinos and some who don't, but who still acknowledge the African experience in Latin America. There's no Latin America. Mexico, you pick the country. Veracruz, the great revolt by Yanga, Mexican, African, the African women who fought Zapatistas in the Mexican Revolution. I mean, come on, and yet if you say Hispanic, Latino, they'll say brown and black, or Latino, Latinx and black. Well, some of those Latinx people also have some African blood. Some of them have a lot of African ancestry, even though when they don't know it, and some don't know it. These are interesting things to discuss. And then Europeans, same is true, have some, African ancestry, both older and younger, not necessarily talked about, both from places like Morocco and Algeria and Egypt, but also from infra-Saharan or tropical Africa. And we need to talk about terminology and rid ourselves of colonialist and racist concepts and paradigms in language and the way we describe things. So I talk about the northeast quadrant of Africa. I talk about infra-Saharan Africa or infra-tropical Africa, super-tropical Africa, super-Saharan. Why? Because these terms force you to think in a different way. Because they're actually more accurate. They're actually more accurate. And also, as I said, we could have a concept, we could develop a whole corpus of work around the notion of Africasia. Some people would say Afro-Arabia, but You could say that, or you could say Africasia. So again, these are a lot of this stuff is arbitrary at a certain level. We have to have people well trained. We're not talking about doing stuff just for the sake of doing it. It actually enhances knowledge production and makes you ask different questions that actually will get to better answers. And I'll never forget one of my professors at Oxford, Ram Hooray, who taught philosophy of science. I learned so much from him about the difference between falling into the eras of positivism versus learning how to think in terms of realism. These are very important concepts. Very important concepts, but we actually know about some of these things in a folk kind of way, in a way that doesn't come from books. Well, we know the difference. We know from our own community that there are people who are Afro-American, legacy African Americans, but who only don't have a lot of African ancestry, and but they are still a part of the community. There are also other people who had no African ancestry that we accepted and we adopted into the community. Then there's some people who claimed to have be a part of the community who were lying. That's a different thing. That's a different thing. But thank you very much.
No, the pleasure is all mine, and I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And I know you're again on the front lines in the hospitals to relay this information to us. Getting back to the COVID-19 topic, and to expand our knowledge not only in terms of history, but in terms of the events now that will become history, in the future. But that's affecting our future, as we know it
right now. Yes.
Yeah.
Be safe. Don't be stupid. The COVID-19 is real. It can kill you. It may not kill you, but it's real. Protect yourself, thereby protect the community. If you have a brother or sister who's involved in the gangs, tell them, look, that's not important. That's not real work. Get out of those things. Get out of those things. Contribute to the real history of the community. If people are involved in those things because they don't feel that they have real connections with people, help them get connections. Help them get funds. Sometimes $5 or $20, a little money goes a long way if people are feeling that they need to do something negative in order just to eat or to feel better. And let's learn how to negotiate with each other in terms of confrontation. Learn how to negotiate and settle conflicts and conflict management based on our own traditions of having to do this in the midst of having been deeply oppressed, to make agreements with each other and to learn how to simply be the best human beings that we are, that we can be, and to increase our thriving, not just surviving. Even if you don't have a lot, you can learn how to thrive, but also be willing to expand these conversations and talk to everyone. This is important. This is important. This is about the survival of humanity in general. Whether you talk about global warming, whether you talk about environmental racism, this is about human beings thriving and not just surviving, but thriving. And this stuff is not a joke. It relates to everybody. And this COVID-19, there'll be another virus that emerges as the climate changes. Some transfer, zoonosis from an animal to a human, or something that's been sitting around for a long time in some pond that hasn't been disturbed for 50,000 years that somebody goes and stirs up because they're looking to cut down wood in the Congolese rainforest because perhaps predatory practices in the globalist economy. Leaders need to stand up, and leaders need to demand the kinds of infrastructure or help that will lead to capacity building, as opposed to things that just lead to consumption. They used to talk about teaching a man to fish If you teach a person, what's the old saying that if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach him how to fish for a lifetime, teach him how to fish, he can eat for a lifetime. And I would say you have to teach how to fish, how to store the fish, how to further get other products from the fish, how to elaborate on the fish, and how to market the fish, those products that you get from the fish. So we're talking about capacity building, and we're talking about, and this applies across the board, whether you're in Africa and you're dealing with neo-colonialism from wherever it comes from, including your own eternal elites, or within our own Afro-North American community, our legacy Afro-North American community, which I distinguish from other African communities that are more recent origin, like Somalis, Egyptians, Algerians. These are all Africans. I don't care what the census tells them to mark on their form. They're African people. So if you're an Algerian or Egyptian, to put African American and let them figure it out. This is nonsense. Oh, and by the way, not the Abusir material comes from a place not far from the Fayoum, which is where we had the earliest agriculture in the Nile-Valley, and where that agriculture is clearly seasonal and not a total transformation of subsistence in the way that it later becomes in the Nile-Valley. This is why the statements that I made earlier are true, based on the work of Wilma Wetterstrom in a volume published in 1993. But anyway, there's a site there called the Karunian. Or rather, one of the levels at the Fayoum is related to a late Paleolithic or Epipaleolithic culture called Karunian, Qarunian. If you Google Karunian online, you will see an analysis of the Karunian skull. And I will let your readers go find out what the results of that analysis says. Okay. And that if you wanted to use one skull as a denotation or connotation rather of a population, then that would tell you right there that the implication that the Egyptians had all been Near Easterners is wrong, even in the Abusir region. Okay? All right. Thank you. And you take care.
No problem. No problem.
All right. And I hope your family's doing well. Okay?
They are. They are.
All right.
And so before I log off totally, just want to remind everyone that we will be interviewing next Dr. Adisa Ajamu, who's a psychologist living on the West Coast. It's either going to be either Wednesday or Thursday. We haven't solidified the date and time just yet, but it's going to be Wednesday or Thursday. So if you have not subscribed to the channel, subscribe and hit the bell so you get the notifications when I schedule a show. And then on Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to continue with our mixtape mashup battle part 2. So we experimented last night with it, and we're going to continue to kind of shift away from the serious topics that are normally discussed here. So we're going to dig in the crates and see who has the better music selection in a variety of different categories. So that's going to be 9 p.m. Eastern on Friday. So for that, so Dr. Adisa Ajamu on Wednesday or Thursday. Please subscribe and find out the particular date. And we'll be continuing the COVID-19 discussion, but now we're going to deal with it from a psychological perspective. How does the mental health and all of this fit in terms of the community and helping each other get through this crisis? So that'll be the focus on Wednesday or Thursday. So I look forward to having you all back on the channel, and we hope to have Dr. Keita back on the channel in the near future. And so y'all have a blessed weekend, and I will see you all next week. Peace and blessings.
Take care.